Oh, hi there. My name's Mike Montgomery, and today I'd like to show you how I upcycled this vintage outdoor Eames-style lounge chair into a fresh, modern, indoor-outdoor chair with no upholstery experience. So let's go ahead and get started on modern builds. So Rust-Oleum challenged me to find a vintage piece of furniture that I could upcycle into something awesome. So then I checked Craigslist and I found this old Eames-style lounge chair that was made for an outdoor patio set. It had a black wire frame and was not in the best condition. There's a little bit of surface rust and pitting that I had to deal with, but we'll go over that later on in the video. But for now, let's just get right into it. Here we go. The first thing I did was cut my plywood to size that I'll be making the wooden shells for the seat covers out of. Then I unplugged and took off the guard from my table saw so that I could lower the riving knife, that way it didn't set higher than the saw blade. This allowed me to raise my blade until I was almost cutting through my material. The plywood I'm using is just over 1/8 of an inch, and I need to make these repeated cuts so that I can bend it to match the curves in the chair frame. This technique is called kerf cutting. Essentially, you just remove enough of the material that the plywood becomes more flexible and able to fit the curve of the frame. On the right side, I spaced all my cuts out a 1/16 of an inch, but it turned out I actually liked it more on the left side where I spaced them out 1/8 of an inch, the same as the table saw blade. So now that I cut the plywood to its final size, I used that test piece to lay out all of my lines for where I want my kerf cuts to be. I don't want to cut all the way across the plywood, only where it'll be bending. That way it's more sturdy and more rigid where I need it to be. After I set my fence the right distance from where I wanted my kerf cuts to start, I could cut one side, spin my piece around, and cut the other. Then, I moved my fence over 1/4 of an inch, 1/8 of an inch for the table saw blade, and the other 1/8 of an inch for the spacing. And I just kept doing that over and over again until I met the line that I made earlier. This process is really more intensive during the setup. You just want to make sure that your kerfs are starting and ending in the right spot so that your curves match your frame. That, and making sure that you don't cut through your plywood. I use squeezy clamps to hold my pieces in place so that I can mark the outline of the frame. As you can see, each piece has a curve that I need to sand down so that everything is flush and matches really nicely. At this point, I didn't want to damage the veneer or the kerfs any, so instead of a random orbit sander, I used a 150 grit sanding pad followed by a 220 sanding pad before applying a finish. I'll be using Varathane oil-based polyurethane in a matte finish from this video's sponsor, Rust-Oleum. I used this same finish on my most recent bed video and I was really impressed. In fact, Varathane polyurethane has the fastest dry time of any oil-based poly. Plus, it's self-leveling to help minimize brush strokes. I applied 3 coats, but you want to make sure and at least apply 2 to get good, even coverage. I'll be using 2-inch foam to make the cushions. Here, I'm marking the outline of the shell of the seats. I wanted to do this while it was in the frame so that it wasn't distorted when I flattened everything out later on. Like I mentioned earlier, I have no upholstery experience, although it's something that I definitely want to learn more about, and I thought a great starting point would be these simple cushions that won't be too intimidating for my woodworking audience. First, I layered up 2 sheets of the same plywood that I built the chair shells out of, and you'll notice that the plywood stops right where the bend in the seat starts. That way the cushion can bend freely, while the plywood allows plenty of support and room for stapling all of my fabric down. Speaking of, I'm using vinyl leather. This allows me to use staples instead of other fasteners. So the folds on this cushion are pretty interesting and I hadn't really seen anything like this prior to doing it. I set a fold on the outside of each of my corners and stapled them down where possible. Then I created a second bend on the other side of the curve and stapled that down like a Christmas present. This method allows the corners to be rounded over just like the shells and to match that curve in the frame of the chair too. Of course it's not perfect, but for a first cushion I'm really happy with it and I'm excited to learn more about upholstery in general. With the cushions done, it was time to prep the frame for painting, first by removing the armrests. Then I used acetone to wipe down the frame and clean up any of the rust spots. There was a decent amount of rust on the underside of the armrests and a little bit on the base that I had to take care of. I'll be painting the frame with Rust-Oleum's Stop Rust line of spray enamel paint in flat white. Stops Rust is Rust-Oleum's heritage line that they founded the entire company on back in 1921. It's absolutely #1 in rust protection. The chair does have a little bit of surface rust, especially underneath the armrests, which is why this paint is perfect for this project. And of course, you don't have to get just white. The Stops Rust line from Rust-Oleum has tons of colors in tons of different finishes. And right now, Rust-Oleum is hosting their Spray New Life competition on their Instagram account. All you have to do is post a project that you did using Rust-Oleum spray paints and hashtag Spray New Life and tag @Rust-Oleum. Each month until September 1st, 2018, Rust-Oleum will be giving one winner a $500 Home Depot gift card. So grab some Rust-Oleum paint and spray new life into something awesome. Thanks! While I let the frame dry, I cut some 2x3s into rough stock for the new armrests. I grabbed a pencil and I marked the outline of the old armrest so that I had a reference while I was working. Then I put an 80 grit flap disc on my angle grinder and started carving away. This is a tough process to describe because it is very sculptural and organic, but the idea is just to remove stock until I had gotten close to my line. Then I could finesse everything and round over my corners until it was comfortable and looked good to the eye. Once I had the rough shape carved out with the 80 grit flap disc, I started sanding with my random orbit sander, starting with 80, 150, then 220 grit. As a finish, I applied 3 more coats of the Varathane oil-based polyurethane, same as the plywood shells. This way, everything matched really nicely. Assembling the chair was pretty straightforward. I just needed to remember which pieces of plywood went with which section of the chair, and vice versa. And while he was here, my buddy Ray from the channel Get Crafty Crafty helped me put everything together. His channel is linked in the description.
Just so you know, these are what I'm using. They're actually cable clamps for electrical wire. These are plastic. I'll leave a link to some metal ones in the description.
The cable clamps really are pretty simple. The loop just goes around one of the wires in the frame, and then I used a screw to screw in through the shell and into the plywood backing of the cushion. Not only did this hold the shell in place, but it also kept the cushions from moving any either. The plastic clips work, but I definitely recommend getting some metal ones and painting them white to match the frame. The final step was to attach our armrests, which sort of look like eggplants, to the frame as well. There was already holes drilled through the frame, so all I needed to do was pre-drill the wood so that it didn't split, then drive in some screws.
So overall, I'm really pumped with this project. I've never done upholstery before, like I mentioned, and everything came out really nice. There was a lot of problem solving along the way. I didn't really have a super concrete plan from the beginning. At first, I thought I was gonna bend the plywood, but after a couple tests and failing, I tried my hand at kerf cutting, and I was really happy with the results. This is definitely something that I wanna experiment more with in the future and try and find some projects that it's all oriented around. In terms of making the cushions, using the vinyl leather actually helped out a lot. That meant that I was able to use staples and totally throw everything together in a non-proper way. Upholstery is definitely something I want to learn more about, but this was a good first step. It got me comfortable with the materials and tools, and the next step is to get a sewing machine and try that out. I want to give one more huge thanks to Rust-Oleum for sponsoring this project, along with pushing me to giving it a shot. I'd been wanting to do a video like this for a while, but it's a little bit different than what I'd normally do, and I wasn't super confident. So having a sponsor that was on board with the project and really encouraging me to do it was amazing. If you're new to my channel, I want to say welcome, and if you haven't already, make sure and click this subscribe button. That way you can stay updated every time I post a new project video. And speaking of project videos, 2 will pop up on the screen. Thanks everybody for watching, and until next time, this has been Modern Builds. There was a little bit of I shouldn't have drank this whiskey.